Hello, I'm Margaret Drew. I chair the HIV Impact Project, and I'm thrilled to be here to present this timely webinar on World AIDS Day. Our discussion will be with survivor advocates, and the presenters today are lawyer advocates, and also survivors, those living with HIV. And we want to acknowledge all of the other advocates that do this work who are also survivors. And we thank you for all the work that you do. So during today's program, we encourage you to ask questions through the Q&A and not through the chat function. If you do not see the controls, please ensure your screen is not idle. We will be monitoring the Q&A and we'll do our best to address your questions, time permitting. This webinar will be for 1 hour, and we will get right to it after I want to make another brief acknowledgement. We acknowledge the shootings that took place at Club Q. Not only do we honor the lives of those who passed, but the ongoing trauma suffered by witnesses and generally within the populations who were targets of the shootings. We are reminded how many members of the LGBTQ+ community are at risk just for being who they are. The stigma and vulnerabilities continue. Allison Nichols is Director of Legal Advocacy at the Jean A. Carpenter Legal Defense Fund, the Epilepsy Foundation of America, and is Adjunct Professor of Law at Georgetown University Law Center. Allison is a longtime advocate of those living with HIV or AIDS, and we've invited her to moderate this program today. So Allison, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Margaret, and thanks to everybody out there who has come to be in conversation with us today with these three terrific panelists. I do encourage us to be more of a conversation. We're going to have some presentations, but please ask lots of questions or make statements of your own. And I just want to reiterate Margaret's important statement that, you know, the work of HIV and the work on behalf of people with HIV in the civil rights arena and the criminal arena has always been carried out in partnership, partly with lawyers, but honestly, most of the work over time has been done by people who do not carry a law degree and may not carry any other kind of formal degree, and yet have been an integral part of the successes that have been made in this area. And of course, they should be acknowledged and praised for that work. So I'm going to start today with our friend, longtime friend, Scott Schoettes. And I would like him, Scott, if you can just give us a bit of your personal background, but really we want to hear about what brought you into this work, and not just what brought you into this work, but what has kept you in this work for a long period of time. So why don't you start for us?
Sure. Thank you, Allison. And great to be here with you all today. I'll jump right in because I do have, as usual, quite a bit that I want to get across, and hopefully it will be interesting and not too boring. So I think a lot of people know that that the law for me was a second career, and that actually started my life and my work as an actor, and living in Los Angeles, and then sort of living hand to mouth and moderately successful in eking out a living, but made a decision in 1998 or so that I wanted to change careers. And I was a little tired of living in that hand to mouth sort of way. And I had a brain that I wasn't using. And most importantly, I earned a lot of my living in the musical theater, which in the chorus of shows. So that explains why I wasn't using so much of my brain at the time. But most importantly, I think at that time, I decided that being a lawyer would be a good shift for me, a big one, obviously. But and I had in my head that I would wanted to be an advocate on behalf of the gay community. In particular, at that time, Matthew Shepard had just been killed. And I looked around and said, there's a need for good people to come forward and do this work, whether that's as a lawyer or in some other way. For me, this was part of a career shift to being a lawyer. So I would say I was actually an advocate before I was ever a lawyer. And I kind of had decided on being a lawyer before HIV was ever in the mix. I had a very strange, unusual seroconversion in that I'd already applied to law schools and was on my way, and I'd almost made a decision about where I was going to law school when I started feeling sick, and was like going off to do tours of schools and look at different schools, and was really not feeling well. And over a period of probably, I don't know, 9 months or so, I went to see my doctors, and they tested me for HIV. I was a sexually active gay man. That made perfect sense. And those tests kept coming back negative until finally, it was now the spring of 1999. And I was going to be choosing where I was going to go to law school and do that for that fall. I went to my doctor's office another time. And this time I could not walk across his office without being out of breath. And so, he put me in the hospital, and it wasn't until I was in the hospital and they'd run an actual PCR test, not an antibody test, but a PCR test, that they figured out I had HIV. But not only did I have HIV, I had pneumocystic pneumonia. So it was really being dropped into the deep end, I guess I would say, on HIV. I had when they finally got the pneumonia under control and we did the testing for HIV, I had 109 T cells and a viral load of way over 1 million. Like, they stopped counting. So I was in a pretty serious place. That's technically an AIDS diagnosis, as all of you undoubtedly know. And that's really was my introduction to being a person living with HIV, was those 10 days in the hospital. I think that affected how I sort of engaged with this disease, and how forthcoming I was about it, really from the beginning with family and friends. There was kind of no hiding the fact that I had spent 10 days in the hospital. And so I was pretty out there from the beginning. Although I will say my coming out story as a gay man, sort of similar. Like, I just really came out very fully as soon as I decided that was who I was. But and I actually got pushback from some good friends at the time, someone who I had been on a tour with, who I later discovered was also living with HIV. And he was kind of appalled at the fact that I would let this information out there, that I would tell people that I was living with HIV, and that there were people on tour who knew this information about me. And why did they need to know? And he was quite upset about it. He was also a Black man, someone I had also been intimate with during my time on the tour. And very, very sadly, he is no longer with us. So I learned from that eventually, as this progressed, right, that I think the part of what led to his demise was his inability to be open about his status, to be out there, to be able to talk to people about it, to get the kind of help that he needed. He was very, very private about it. So back to sort of my story in the moment. Here I was living really hand to mouth. I was an actor who I never had any savings. I had a form of insurance, but it was really not good insurance. It was like through a self-employed association. So I had now an AIDS diagnosis, kind of almost, thank God, because that got me on Medicaid right away, which paid for my enormous hospital bill, which I never would have been able to pay for myself, and probably would have taken me years and years to recover from if I had not had that diagnosis and the help of the state in all of that. And I had to make a decision about what I was going to do. I considered for a hot minute delaying going to law school, but ultimately decided no, I should continue on my path, even though I was literally still like bringing my HIV under control when I went off to DC, moved through all my stuff in a truck and moved to DC to begin my time in law school. Fast forward a little bit. Well, one, I would say I was not out in law school about my HIV status. Very deliberate choice. I was out about being gay, super out about being gay, but not about my HIV status. And I thought, there were still so many misconceptions. I think there still are. And I thought, even if I do well in school, how are people at law firms, how are partners at law firms going to view me? Are they going to view me as a person that they want to make a long-term investment in? Because their perception would be that I would not be around for very long. So I kept that hidden, including in law school interviews. I would ask interviewers what it was like to be a gay associate at their law firm, but I would not ask them anything about HIV or reveal my HIV status. So I think it's important piece of this puzzle that, that was a dichotomy that I needed to maintain. I ended up clerking for a federal judge, and then I went into a big law firm. I'd done well enough in law school that I was able to get into a big law firm. And I was pretty quiet about my HIV status there for a number of years. Again, I felt like I needed them to sort of invest in me and know me before I could reveal that status. And indeed, that's what I eventually did. Once I felt comfortable and I'd been there for a little while, I disclosed my status. I actually did it I was doing the AIDS life cycle in California, and I decided I could raise a lot more money if I told people about my HIV status. And by that time, I felt like, well, now they know me, and they'll have to integrate this piece of information into what they already know about me, as opposed to meeting someone and that being like the first thing they know about you. It felt very different. So I came out there, and that's also when I moved to Lambda. Interestingly, when I went to Lambda, my first the job I applied for was to be a civil rights advocate just for gay, LGBTQ people. Although I think even at that time we didn't have the Q on there, we did have the T. But the job that I applied for went to someone who had more years of experience. I had about 5 years of experience as a litigator at that point. And but there were these two more junior jobs that they said, hey, would you be interested? Because of course, during my interview for Lambda, I had revealed my HIV status. And one of those jobs was the HIV project staff attorney. And so they wanted to know if I was interested in that. And I, of course, was. And so that's how I ended up there. So, it wasn't that HIV advocacy was the goal, but that, over time became the perfect fit. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about just then how it has affected my work. First of all, obviously, I have skin in the game, right? In a way that maybe someone living with HIV doesn't have quite the same skin in the game. And we see this all across the work, right? There are LGBTQ people that work at places like Lambda Legal, and there are cisgender straight people who work in those places and do excellent, excellent work. But I do feel like it was an advantage, one, to have that skin in the game, but more importantly, my ability to relate to clients who are living with HIV, which all of my clients basically are people living with HIV, was just different, and I think really important in a lot of situations. I would just could talk to them and converse with them in a way I understood a lot of what they had been through. And that's part of the reason I shared some of my stories. Like, well, I've been in a lot of different places with my HIV. I've experienced a lot of different things. It wasn't always easygoing. Although I have an issue with the term survivor. We can maybe talk about that later. But I'd experienced some discrimination, certainly. I tried to have those conversations around disclosure. I knew how difficult those conversations could be. Had many of those conversations around disclosure. I'd been in a relationship with someone who was living with HIV for a while, and then I was not in that relationship, and those experiences are different. are different. Just the other day, actually, I was talking to a client and, who was not adherent to his medication. And, we needed to talk about that. And as a person living with HIV, it was just so much easier for me to have that conversation. And because I could acknowledge that I'm not perfectly adherent to my medication. And I think to present that in a way that was just a lot less judgmental, or would come across as a lot less judgmental to that person. So I'll close up there. I guess I feel like I do sort of know HIV from the inside out, and that has really informed my advocacy, both on how bad it can be and how capable people living with HIV are. And I feel like that's almost the more important perspective to bring sometimes into advocacy circles, so that we're really bringing along the whole community. So I think being a person living with HIV myself has helped me do that.
Thanks, Scott. Venita, can you go next for us and just to, tell us as much of your story as you are comfortable doing. And then I think it would be really interesting and important for the audience to know more about the organization that you're currently working for and the kind of work that they're doing.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Allison. I love talking about PWN. Hello, everybody. Venita Ray here. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I am currently the co-executive director of the Positive Women's Network, which is the only national membership organization for women and people of trans experience living with HIV. So we're a membership organization and we're a leadership and advocacy organization. So it's a really perfect fit for me in the sense that I get to use all my skills and combine a personal and professional passion and to do the work that I do. So did I, as a little girl, sit down and dream to one day be this and be a woman living with HIV since April 2nd, 2003, and be doing this work and living out loud as a person living with HIV? No, not on the little list of things I want to do when I grow up. But most of my stories and how I got into legal work have to do with the way I was raised and growing up in a kind of not ideal family situation with my mom, and then getting pregnant at a young age and having my daughter at the age of 15. And I have to say, before that, I really, even though home life wasn't great, I excelled in school. And I remember a teacher telling me in 5th grade, you could be a lawyer. And I remember when she said it, the only lawyers I saw was on TV. The neighborhoods I lived in, nobody, trust me, we weren't having those kind of conversations. So even though I heard it, I didn't have the self-confidence to believe that I could ever do it. And so it was a little flame she lit, but it didn't have any air to breathe. So the flame kind of died. After having my daughter at a young age and just ignoring all of the things that folks said I could be, because I didn't feel those, I eventually got into drugs and things. And when I got about 27, I got clean and sober. And I remember that I hadn't graduated from high school. So I went back to get a diploma. And I was going to a fellowship, a 12-step fellowship, who somebody, asked me, what did I want to be? And I didn't know what to say, right? It's like, now that you're here, what do you want to do? And I remember coming back, that she gave me time, and I came back and said, I want to be a lawyer. And I'm gonna be honest, the reason why I said I want to be a lawyer is because that teacher said it back then. I didn't have any more faith that I could do it at that point either. Again, I didn't know nobody. I think I met a guy in the program, his name is David, who went to law school. And I remember thinking, oh my God, he was the only, live representation of someone from where I was who had did something, but I didn't believe I could do it. And so once I put it out, those folks would not let me take it back. And so they began to, I began to just take one class a night, 2 classes a semester. And I believed it because they believed it. And so I've got my high school diploma. Then I just start taking classes. And again, I'm believing it because they believe it. I really still didn't believe I could ever do it. And 10 years later, a lot of sweat and tears and support, I eventually left San Diego where I was raised, and when it got time to apply for law schools, I'm like shocked that I didn't graduated a bachelor's degree, but I started applying for all these schools and eventually selected American University in DC. So it also involved moving like a pioneer woman is the way I felt, setting off in my car with everything in my car, and everybody wondering, is she crazy? You got a daughter that's 20 and you had a good job and you're going to do this. Well, they never knew, where I come from, you just get a good job. It ain't about working in something you love. It's all about survival. So no one gives up a good job to go off on a dream. And so it's just a Black folk rule. I don't know what other communities, but you just don't do that. And I have begun to believe in something outside of myself because other people did. And I did. I went to law school and did fairly well, and began to discover the kind of work I wanted to do. I'd always known that I was a public servant. I always knew that my mission was to serve. And, I've been an advocate in a lot of ways already. When I got in law school, I started I helped create another law school clinic, but I started doing work in the public housing, and affordable housing became a big deal. And I started doing land use and zoning work. And it was all from a point of advocacy of teaching communities how to be engaged and fight for the conditions they want in their communities. So that was my real work, in my perspective, even though, that wasn't my boss's real work. I worked for the District of Columbia government at the Office of Corp Counsel for a number of years, but I did a lot of community work trying to empower communities. And so for me, in April 2nd, 2003, I had come full circle, finally arrived, overcome all this. And so I have to give that context because it really is why when the diagnosis came back positive, it was so crushing to me because I thought I had finally overcome, and I was living good. My daughter was going to college back in Cali, and I had the dream job doing the work I wanted to do, and I had the dream house that I was remodeling. And then I got a physical and got a call saying, you need to come in to talk about your test. And I remember saying, what test? And she said, well, I'd rather wait till you get here, right? And I said, is it the HIV test that I'd asked her to do with my physical? And she said, yes. And, that was April 2nd, 2003. The lights went off that day and didn't come back on for 4 more years. I didn't go back to work for a month. All I did was close shut my computer off, turn my light off. I walked out my office, never said a word, and eventually emailed someone. But it was really a hard pill to take for me because everybody wanted to say, you've been this strong person. And I didn't feel like I could shoulder one more burden at that time. So it was like, stick a fork in me and I'm done. I was full of shame and guilt, even though I'd known people living with HIV. It was a different thing when you get your own diagnosis. And so I eventually lasted for maybe a year. And being just non-responsive, I would go to work and try to function and go home and die every night for a year. And finally, I quit the job, sold the house, and moved to Houston, where I am now, which I said I would never come to, but I came here to die, living with my daughter had moved here and my sister were here. And, over the next couple of years, I know it helped me evolve. And finally, I got willing 4 years later, when it was like either kill yourself or move on, and to go, find a group of people and a support group. And it was a long process. In 2011, I went public with my status. Still wasn't in advocacy because I still couldn't go nowhere and talk about HIV. But that was the beginning for me. And I began to do more after that and discovered the Positive Women's Network in 2014, when Legacy Community Health asked me if they'd had this little grant and said, we're supposed to do a leadership program for people living with HIV, and we don't know what to do with it. It was $20,000, y'all, that I was going to get paid for a whole year of work. And I tried to get back into law. And, when you have the gap, I couldn't get anyone to hire me as a lawyer. I took the Texas bar, passed it. No one would still hire me. And so I had to find some way else to serve community. And when I started doing leadership development of people living with HIV, it just fit for me because it was just a culmination someplace I could bring everything, life experience, lived experience, and knowledge to the table of communities I'd worked with in DC, of work I'd done there, and it just fit. And from there, working with those communities on an ongoing basis and people to do what they do. And I discovered Positive Women's Network. And at that time, I became a board member. Then in 2018, I was deputy director. And then 2020 became the co-executive director. Blows me away that I live out loud, that I get to apply everything to where I am now. And I'm a ferocious advocate. I will, if you know me, you know I'm not kidding. And it's because I bring the passion of the streets to me in what I do. And, you know, I began to notice the conversations were very stigmatizing as a Black woman living with HIV. You know, people would always talk about our numbers and it was very hard to listen to, but no one talked about why. And so a lot of my work has gotten into those structural and systemic issues that are at play that we see in law from a litigation standpoint. You know, thank God for, you know, Brown versus Board of Education and all of these kinds of things, but people have needs today, right? And so how do we show them how to deal with their own needs? And that's became just a place that worked for me. And in the work that I do now, my work is impacted because I do have a professional kind of way that I look at things and analyze things, but I balance it off with my lived experience and what I do to bring community up. And, you know, being a Black woman living with HIV, you would think because of our numbers, it wouldn't be a rare commodity, but in some of the spaces I go in, it is. And, you know, so it's important for me to represent, you know, who I am in all regards in my work. And this is the only time that I've been able to bring all of me to a movement. You know, my Blackness, because I talk a lot about racial justice, which I think in the racial injustice is a driver of the epidemic. But then I also get to just be here as a woman, mother, sister, grandmother as well, and wanting to make this world a better place or empower people, because everyone has their own power to do this. We are the interpreters of the law sometimes, and we have to break it down for folks in a way that when we leave somebody, they can move and show someone else, not just hoard the knowledge here and not try to talk about law as being complicated. Make it simple. And how do we empower folks to do for themselves because they can, and where are those places they can do it? So PWN provides me that. We have members all over the country and they're doing advocacy campaigns, leadership development, and it just really works for me. So I thank you for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to kind of share a little bit about the work.
Thank you for sharing all of that. And I actually didn't know you were a grandmother. So congratulations. That's great. Brad, let's move to you next. And Brad is our man in California.
Yeah. Thank you. And it's thanks, Scott and Venita, for sharing your stories. And I can relate to a lot of what you were talking about. My path to becoming a lawyer was I grew up in a small town in Missouri, and there was one lawyer and everyone knew his name. And I was like, oh, I want to be like that guy. And so that kind of got that seed planted when I was kind of in elementary school. Like everyone pays attention to, his name was Mark Rains. Everyone knows who Mark Rains is. So I should do what he does. And eventually kind of as I grew up, wanted to become a civil rights lawyer, started doing more of a focus kind of on voting rights in the Midwest, in the South. And then after I seroconverted, focused more on LGBTQ and HIV issues. I became HIV positive in the early 1990s. It was, I think, maybe the time of the least amount of hope in the epidemic, because the success of the initial drugs was shown to be limited in time. In kind of 91 to 93, studies came out that showed they kind of just delayed things for a relatively short period of time. So when I seroconverted, I thought I've got 10 years to live, and so I'm really grateful to be alive today. And it turns out I didn't have 10 years. I was what's called a rapid progressor. And so I had an AIDS diagnosis by 95. Still at a time where all of the effective medications, the protease inhibitors, the kind of use of a cocktail combination of drugs had not been approved yet. They were in clinical trials at that point, but they got approved and I got access to them in 1996. My health and immune system kind of built up slowly over, from then, to the present. So I do feel very grateful for that. My first job as a lawyer was doing legal services for people with HIV, and today it would be called a medical legal partnership. But my first 4 years as a lawyer was sitting in clinics in LA County, all over LA County, which is a huge county. The community clinics for people living with HIV, and talking to them, kind of doing a legal assessment and then following up based on their legal needs. So I had the honor to meet and counted up like 800 people I think I talked to in those years about their experiences. Again, in a time that was getting a little less scary, but it's still a scary time. And I think it's a time still filled with a lot of fear about, whether you're going to feel well, whether you're going to die. And where the issues we talked about were the range of issues impacting people who have been kind of shut out of the economy, who have overlapping issues of kind of marginalization, stigmatization, and HIV is, kind of a symptom of those, or another thing that is allowed to happen to certain parts of people in this country and other countries. So I think all of that informed, kind of that experience kind of informed kind of my advocacy and what I'm passionate about in several ways. And I guess I'll say the first, I think as a person living with HIV, and my activism began with a group in LA called Being Alive Los Angeles, so an of, by, and for people with HIV organization, is that kind of our experience is critical. And that there's a lot of professional people in law, in medicine, and in public health who have perspectives and can help, but have required a lot of prodding and a lot of pushing and a lot of activism over the years from people with HIV to be responsive to what we need and what's actually going on. And so I think that very much informs my perspective. And I'll just run through a few of the issues because I think some of them continue to today. So first of all, my end game in that world of kind of medicine, public health, and policy is still for a cure. I don't dream, and I don't think people with HIV dream of being in the last bar in the treatment cascade and having medications for life. That's not my dream. But that is the dominant image that we see about progress in this field. And I think at least from my perspective, I still want a cure. I still want people to be free of these diseases. I want people to be free of taking the medications, which have changed a lot. Thankfully, I'm on one pill a day. In those initial years, it was kind of, I think, 14 pills twice a day, some refrigerated, some not, some stank, some did not. But that kind of, the toxic effects of all of that over decades is something that I think a lot of us continue to live with. So it's keeping our eyes on that focus. I think the second thing is healthcare access is hugely important, and I think it's so much better today than when I became positive. I made about $30,000 a year when I became HIV positive. My copays on my medications were $500 a month, and there was no way for me to really live in LA and have those copays going out every month, having $6,000 for the drugs, and that was good insurance at that time. And I think there's more access today, but it's important that we keep those access for people, and that access is not the same for people in every state. There was and there continues to be a lot of stigma, and so a lot of what I spent my time doing in the 90s and the early 2000s was discrimination, healthcare discrimination cases, people who were denied treatment by dentists, OBGYNs, surgeons, seeking healthcare, and people who wanted to be healthcare providers, including people who were HIV positive, who wanted to be phlebotomists and do HIV testing, being told they couldn't because they were HIV positive. So it was really pushing back against that discrimination. And the way you prevent discrimination is through privacy. And so it was interesting going through the COVID pandemic and seeing those privacy kind of issues. Even I'm at UCLA, it was just like, yeah, let's collect the information from everybody. And everyone's manager will have all the information about their symptoms every day. And I was just like, there are differences between the disease, but the kind of casual way in which those privacy concerns and even some of the protections from the ADA were just like, we just need this information, so we're going to collect it, and let whoever is in people's workplace have that information. I think it's still things that we need to pay attention to, because that is the front line against privacy, or against discrimination and stigma. A lot of my work focuses on criminalization. I remember being a young man in my 20s in the 1990s when California passed its felony law, and that shaped my dating and sexuality. That was a fear that I had, because I am in recovery as well. I wasn't always perfect in my behavior, and so there was a real fear there. And even if I was, it's he says issue at the end of the day. And so any relationship that ended or didn't ended well, there was a threat of a complaint or a lawsuit out there. And so that was a very real thing that I'm now free of in California, but that many people in other states, as we know, kind of continue. And I guess I'll just wrap up with some half-baked thoughts about kind of identity and intersectionality and death. So, real positive note. I have a lot of different identities, right? And one of them was being HIV positive. And when there were no medications, and kind of more stigma and discrimination, that was a very important identity to me. And I think that has shifted, and some of the community activism has shifted from the early 90s and mid 90s to today, because people can live their lives and be HIV positive, and it doesn't have to be something that absolutely shapes their life in the same way. And so I think, to me, that's an important kind of thing to think about in all the areas of activism I do, is the different identities that we hold and kind of our importance, and how we keep community together as things shift around those identities, and as public reactions towards those identities shift. I think early on, again, talking to hundreds of people with HIV, it became clear that this was just a symptom of other problems in our society. It was not a surprise, I think, to any of us that COVID went to the same communities that HIV did, because it flowed through the same kind of disparities, economic disparities caused by racial injustice in this country, and until we address those, the next epidemic is going to do the same thing. Like, it's just, that's what we've set up in this country. And it was the map of where HIV cases are looks like the map of concentration of COVID cases, and until we solve those issues, we can't solve that. So really taking a broader approach in all this work, I think, has become increasingly important over time. And I guess I'll just end with death. I began with being grateful for being alive. I feel like for a 53-year-old man, I have seen a lot of death. And that includes scores of people who I knew that have died of HIV. It also includes probably more people who've died as a result of addiction. At the intersection of those are people who've taken their own lives. And, Margaret, I think you started with Club Q, and I have known two people fairly well who've been murdered by people preying on LGBTQ people. And all of those things work together, kind of the homophobia, the transphobia that leads to violence and gets fed by anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, the disregard for the lives of people of color, the kind of marginalization and stigma that leads to low self-esteem, that can contribute to things like addiction, and to the types of behaviors that lead to exposure to HIV. All of those work together, and it's a complicated and a difficult things to address. But I guess for me, this is life and death, and unfortunately, that didn't stop in 1996 when we got better medications. Just the reasons why people are dying have kind of shifted with the folks that I know today.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. Just a couple of follow-up comments to that. I completely agree with you that when we, as horrific as COVID has been, it brought with it some fascinating civil rights issues and some issues as, I'm a lifelong disability rights lawyer in the more traditional sense as well. And, to be in meetings with federal agencies and others, so casually talking about state policies where if you are a person, with a certain kind of developmental disability or some other kind of disability, we're not wasting a ventilator on you, and how to the allocation of these scarce resources. I think what's a real wake-up call to some of us has worked in this area for decades, thinking, well, I thought we solved this problem. I thought we had lawsuits and, we told people they couldn't do this anymore and everyone agreed we weren't going to, measure someone's life based on whether or not they have HIV or whether or not they're a person with a developmental disability or whatever it may be. And that all just went overboard just in about 2 seconds. And so I agree with you. It was really quite startling to see that. And I was reminded recently that I think this year is the 44th anniversary of the assassination of Harvey Milk and George Moscone in San Francisco. And that was, of course, in the late 70s, sort of the nascent early days of the real beginnings, of a more robust LGBT movement for civil rights. And, 5 years after that, we were involved in the HIV pandemic. And I have to believe that that those two things, not that they're tied together, but that it would have been much easier for us to address HIV in a more positive way if there weren't as much violence against people in those communities. I mean, I'm speaking about one of those communities of color, of course, could be part of the GLBT community or not. But just speaking through the LGBT lens, I think, when people feel like they're being hunted and the government's not doing much about it, just on the basis of who they are, for them to be able to come forward and trust that government with their healthcare, I think is enormously complicated. So I completely agree with you. And Club Q is again another sad reminder that it's not, we all talk about being out and we are out, and yet Congress is having to pass this week a bill to protect gay marriages. I mean, I'm a gay married person, and I didn't think that was going to be necessary in my lifetime. Of course, as a woman, I didn't think it was necessary to codify Roe either. So I think the point is all civil rights laws are always just a good beginning. And, you've got to always be ever vigilant, because the people working against you are waiting in the tall weeds every single day to come back. And I think we've seen a lot of that over the course of the last 4 years. But I want to talk about, we are at 1:44, but I do want to talk about a couple of those issues more broadly with all of you. One, I think, is disclosure. I think we would all agree, all of us certainly in the GLBT community would agree that what part of the progress we've seen is attributable to people being out. I mean, Harvey Milk said, if I get assassinated, let it open every closet door, we must be out. And that will neutralize stigma and it will neutralize discrimination. People will know who we are. I think that's proved to largely be true. I want to know, and I will be clear, I do not have the lived experience of being a person with HIV. And I'm a longtime employment lawyer. So when people ask me, should they be out about their HIV status in the context of work, I give an answer that probably most of the panelists and others don't like, which is, well, no, I don't think you want to do that, because I see all the bad outcomes from that. But what I don't see is the individual empowerment that comes from someone being out, and the neutralizing effect also, that radiating sort of neutralizing effect that people being out about their status can have more generally. So I just wanted to talk to get a sense from each of you of what you think about, what would you advise a young person today about being out about their status?
I wanted to make a comment, actually, sort of dovetailing also with what you just said, which relates to this, because there is a sort of a flip of the paradigm that you were talking about, right? About how it's more difficult to address HIV and AIDS because of the existing discrimination against LGBTQ people. And I think the HIV/AIDS epidemic accelerated the LGBTQ civil rights movement, because there was this crisis, because it was a crisis that unfortunately forced a lot of people out of the closet, but was also affecting not just the most marginalized folks, but was affecting people who were able to sort of exist in the closet and in a more privileged way. And suddenly they were directly affected by this disease and by the lack of power and resources and et cetera that were being given to addressing it. And so it motivated and changed those people's perspectives. They could no longer have sort of the luxury of being in the closet. Sometimes people's HIV forced them out of the closet. And so I think that played an important role. And, there was a dynamic going on there. And then, of course, we get to the point where there are the HIV medications. And I want to acknowledge that I got my diagnosis after the HIV medications. And maybe we can go back to talk about this, but very different thing, right? Than folks like Brad who got it before the effective medications. But we got the medications, and guess what? The privileged people who had access to care, got to all go back into the closet. I mean, they couldn't go back if they were out already, but people who became HIV positive, it's like, oh yeah, you could be HIV positive and you could be, no one needed to know. And so, so that brings me to your question, and maybe I'll let others take a stab at the question, but I think that's an important sort of baseline of how we've actually gone during the pandemic.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Venita or Brad or both of you, comments? Anything you want to say about that?
So I think, what would I say to someone? I would say that unfortunately, you need to think long and hard about this, because we have not arrived. It is not like diabetes. The world still is we're still heavily stigmatized by broad society. And, and there's nowhere to be safe really when you disclose that once it's out, you can't pull it back. And so, because I hear, because I do a lot of work with folks all over the country and people living with HIV, and then, they get very inspired and they want to be an advocate. And I have to always say, whoa, wait, you can be an advocate without disclosing, right? We do have folks living with HIV. You would never know who are out there doing things, because I want them to think long and hard before they go that direction, because you can't pull it back. And once it's out in any form, it's game for everybody. And so many people I get calls about someone outed them and stuff, and they think they can do something, and there's not, So in a lot of instances, you're not violating HIPAA or something. These just people throwing, because it's known, and throw it out there. You'd have to be trying to sue people individually everywhere. And that you really, it's a decision you need to not make lightly. When I decided to go, I was still working on a job that no one knew that my status, because I wasn't comfortable with that, And when I decided to go come out, with my status, I had to call my daughter, who is an attorney also, and say, daughter, are you okay with this? Because when I come out, she comes out. So we have family members we have to be mindful of too. And then once you're out there, you're open game to whatever. So it just needs to be thought of long and hard. I definitely don't recommend for any newly diagnosed person, because I think you need some time to get over that shock and that emotional response to this diagnosis. It's not purely a physical response. There's an emotional one that folks have. So I'm just not great into that. And I want to just comment on, ADA recognizes HIV as a disability, right? But we don't get protection, all the time. And folks might say, oh, well, they can't fire you. But when we do get fired, folks don't have always the emotional bandwidth to do anything about it, because you still get outed and then you have to fight it. So there are so many people, there's hundreds of secret Facebook groups where people feel safe to talk in. And, sometimes, being brought up on HIV crim charges, maybe you can defend it, but you still are outed, right? So it's like, these protections don't mean a lot in the moment, is what I'm trying to say, for someone whose life could be crushed over a news story and where they may not have shared it. So in my perspective, some of those protections don't mean a lot to us. When I know a woman who went to a doctor in Arizona, and her ID doc sent her there to get a well woman exam. When they found out she was positive, they left her in, because they did a little intake with her, and she told them her medicine. Then she was in the waiting room forever. And then they finally said, well, we can't see you. She said, the doctor doesn't see people like you. And she said, well, what do you mean? Black, overweight? And then she thought, my HIV, and they would never say it. And she said, don't you use universal precautions, gloves? They eventually called the police to take this woman out of there because she was just so adamant. What do you mean? I've known people that get put out in dentist offices when they find out. So accessing healthcare is a stressor, and we don't always have the bandwidth to fight to uphold our legal rights, because this is not just a physical thing, it's an emotional one as well. And the social stigma still persists, even if you be healthy. We had Betty Price on the Georgia legislative floor saying that maybe since she can't tell us apart, we ought to be quarantined. And that just happened a few years ago when her husband was Secretary of HHS. So for all the places far we've come, we still have a long way to go from stigma.
Absolutely.
I totally agree with all that. And the other thing I would just add is that the people's work lives now, or like a lot of jobs over the course of your life. And so it's not even about like know your workplace. It's like kind of know your trajectory and know your community, because your career isn't going to end, particularly for younger people. I'd only be a couple of years in this job. And if you're working at a restaurant and then you're going to go to another restaurant, other people are also making that same transition. And so I think people really have to take into account kind of their where they think they're going with their career and their whole community, not just even your present workplace.
And
We know a lot of people.
Okay, so
go ahead, Scott. No, go ahead.
I was going to make two quick comments. One is when Venita was talking, I was thinking about the paradox that still exists of once you're out there, right? Like on the internet, everyone can find it, and you still have to disclose all the time. Like it's a continuing thing, right? Because you're going to come across people who didn't see that information on the internet. So you still have to deal with disclosure, even though like you can be as out as you want to be. And that still is a daily or, regular thing. And then the other thing that is interesting, and I'd like to hear, Brad's perspective on this. And I do feel like the stigma has gone down within the community of gay men that, sort of I circulate in as my social group. And I attribute that to U equals U, and to the availability of PrEP. And it's an interesting thing because that is, at least in part, a result of people being more out about their status, and to your point. And so I do feel like it has been reduced, and it's easier to be out among gay men now than it used to be as someone living with HIV.
I totally agree. And again, like here's my example of local context matter. I was on the East Coast and mainly in kind of New York City, in the early 1990s. And if you were a gay man, people just talked about it. You went out and you met someone and you talked about it. I moved to LA and no one said a word. Like, it was not like, no one said a word. And I can't tell you how many people through the mid 90s, late 90s, when I would, meet someone and tell them HIV positive, they would tell me they'd never, no one had ever done that they'd never met someone who was HIV positive. And I was like, you're in LA. I'm pretty sure you have, but it's again, I just think it's a different environment. So I think things have gotten a lot better, and I still think a lot of people don't have the education they need.
So let me say a couple things. First is we've sort of touched on criminalization a couple of times. I'm not sure all of our attendees know what that means, but in many states, the majority of states still, there are criminal laws on the books. Some are recent, some are older, but still in effect and still being used, where you can be a person where if you are a person with HIV, and you have share intimacy with someone who is not does not have HIV, and you cannot prove in a court of law that you disclosed prior to that act, you can be charged with a crime, sometimes a very serious crime, a felony level crime. And they, for instance, sex workers are sort of routinely upcharged with a felony versus a misdemeanor for simply being a person with HIV. And so wherever you live, I think it's good for you to know about whatever the law is where you are. And I will just caution you again, as a civil rights lawyer, be really careful about the things you say online, because you call it a profile, I call it evidence that can be used against you. So be careful about that. I did want to at least get that set on the table. And the other thing is there's a number of questions here about, are things worse in red states than blue states with respect to healthcare? I think the general answer to that is yes, which brings me sort of full circle to how you can become involved in this work, whether you have a law degree or not, whether you have a professional degree or not. There is always a role for you. Lobbying your state legislature for expansion of healthcare coverage is something you can do without any kind of a degree. You can easily get training to do that. And most of the funding and where the money's going to go does occur at the state level. So you don't have to come to Washington and come to the Capitol to do that work. I'm a lawyer by trade, and so I obviously believe in the transformational value of litigation that has just changed this world for the better. But so have lots and lots of individuals all over this country doing non-legal work every single day, helping individual people in getting healthcare, in managing their personal life, in managing their employment life. And so please, we invite you to come and be in this fight with us, regardless of your educational circumstance. That's the second thing I wanted to mention. I wanted to acknowledge one group that I think sort of gets under-acknowledged, and that is the people who have come forward to be plaintiffs in these lawsuits. Talk about being out in a fairly spectacular way, to be a named plaintiff in a class action lawsuit and be like the head person with HIV. It takes a lot of courage. They'll just like being the named plaintiffs in the marriage cases. It takes a lot of courage. And not everyone, I acknowledge that not everyone is in a safe space to do that. So it's not, I don't mean to say that everyone should be doing that, but I think we have to acknowledge that people having that courage to come forward and be in that position is what has allowed, those are the real heroes. I take those people's stories into court, but for those people, we would not have had the successes that we have now.
Yeah, we so appreciate those folks. And I think it is harder than even being, my experience at Lambda, we very rarely now have a LGBTQ person who wants to proceed under pseudonym. But a lot of my clients on the HIV side wanted to proceed under pseudonym, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, I don't think that's changed. We are now at 2:00. And so I'm going to thank you to all of you It was such a privilege to moderate this panel, and I've known you all for a long time and could not be more praising of you. People who work in the service of others for a cause greater than themselves are both rare and to be admired, and that is certainly true of all of you. So Margaret, with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, just again, thank you to all of our panelists, and also thank you for those who participated. And we have a hard close at 2, so I'll just say thank you again.